Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 13 of the Bible Together reading program here at First Christian Church in Jefferson City, Missouri. This week we are finishing up the book of Deuteronomy and getting ready to turn to the book of Joshua. But what I noticed as we've been finishing up Deuteronomy in these last few chapters of it, that the readings from there do not leave a lot of room for us to hide. These readings confront us with something that I think we would often rather avoid thinking about, and that is God's justice. We see that God's justice is very real and that it is not neutral. The message in these last few chapters of Deuteronomy is almost relentless. If you align your life with God's ways, then there is life abundant and thriving. But if you don't, it's not that things will just go a little off. Everything begins to unravel. The list of consequences is long and detailed and almost overwhelming because this isn't just abstract theology. When these texts made the transition from oral history to written history, it was at a time when the community was looking back at its own ruin, at its exile from the promised land, and asking, how did we get here? And the answer is, we drifted, we compromised, we built our lives on something other than God, and it didn't hold. But here's where it gets personal. When we turn to Jesus in our readings from Luke, someone interrupts him while he is in the middle of teaching, not with a theological question about the Spirit, but with a legal dispute. Hey, Jesus, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. It sounds like a question about fairness and justice, but Jesus refuses. He doesn't take the case. He doesn't weigh the evidence. Instead, he says, watch out for greed. That's jarring because it forces a harder question. How often do we call something justice when it's really about getting what we think we deserve? How often do we wrap self-interest in the language of righteousness? Because we're not usually the villains in our own stories, are we? We're the ones who feel overlooked, undervalued, cheated, and maybe sometimes we are. But that's not where Jesus starts. He starts with a warning. Be careful, because the line between justice and greed is thinner than you think. And then he tells the story about the man with the barns, a man who, from where I'm standing, looks like he's doing kind of the right things. His harvest thrives and he's succeeded, so it looks like he's planning wisely. He says, my barns aren't big enough. I'll tear them down and build some more. He's securing his future and making good investments, right? But God calls him a fool for it. Not because he broke some kind of rule, but because he was trusting in the wrong thing. He believed his life could be secured by what he accumulated, and it couldn't. This is what God's justice does. It doesn't just punish wrongdoing. It exposes truth about our motives, our assumptions, and the quiet ways we center ourselves and call it holy. And that's uncomfortable because it means the question isn't just, am I being treated fairly? It's also, am I seeking God's justice or just my own advantage? But then Jesus turns a corner and says, do not be afraid. Not because everything is just fine, but because you don't have to live like that. You don't have to grasp. You don't have to secure everything for yourself. Because God already knows what you need. God already wants to give you the kingdom. But stepping into that kind of life requires something real. Repentance, a turning, a releasing, a willingness to let go of what feels justified but isn't actually life-giving. So, The question I leave you to sit with this week is, where might you be calling something justice that's actually just hard to see greed? And what would it look like to let God redefine the difference? Thanks for joining me this week, friends, for another tricky passage. I hope you will join me again next week for week 14. Have a great day.